Well, Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri has announced he intends to challenge the Electoral College results, potentially triggering a vote in Congress. So a lot of people are wanting to know, does this mean Trump could still end up president in this next term? That is what we're going to find out here. So to give us more insight into this, because this is a very complicated, kind of archaic law, Ryan Tate, former candidate for Maricopa County attorney, is here. Thank you, Ryan, for joining the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kim.
Okay, so I think the first question everybody wants to know is, does this mean Donald Trump could still end up being president?
This likely won't do it. There is a legal mechanism where he could become president still. That's still legally possible, but this is not the route that's going to accomplish that.
Okay, so let's start with, what is Josh Hawley doing, Senator Josh Hawley doing, and then we'll eventually get into the what is the path still for Trump to end up president. Depending on, if you're watching this show and you're pro-Trump, that would mean Trump, still remaining president of the United States. And if you're against Trump, my guess is you would feel like that's him stealing the election. So we're going to find out what that path would be. So let's start off with what Senator Josh Hawley is doing.
Yeah, so the way that the elections work in America, everybody knows that you don't actually vote for the president. You vote for your slate of electors who then vote for the president. And for instance, in Arizona, where I live, we have 11 electors. So whoever wins the popular vote in most states, in all 48 but 50 states, it's a winner take all. So the candidates' electors actually get to cast their vote. So for instance, in Arizona, Biden had 11 electors, Trump had 11 electors. Since Biden won the official vote, then his electors get to cast their vote.
So they're the ones who actually go off to Washington, D.C. physically.
They don't physically go off to Washington. They actually cast their vote in the state, usually at the state capitol. And then there's a certificate that's signed by the governor certifying that the electors have cast their vote for the candidate that they have. And that certificate is what goes to Washington.
Okay.
And so it gets to Washington. It's counted then on January 6th in a joint session of Congress by the vice president, who counts the votes. And when the votes are read, they go alphabetical order, starting with, I guess it'd be Alabama would go first. So
Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Cali. Do you remember that song?
I never heard that song, so I'm glad I got Alabama right. So Alabama would be read first. And then as soon as it gets to a state where there's a challenge, then you can have an objection to that. And that's what Senator Hawley's planning on doing, I believe, is challenging the results of the election in states where there's been these allegations of voter fraud. So what happens is he has to have another member from the House that seconds, essentially, that writes an objection, and then they have to take a break from voting and they get to debate and vote on that.
Okay, so when one of the states is read, so I would guess like Pennsylvania or Georgia maybe, or I don't know, how many states are being contested right now still?
I believe that there's 7 that are being talked about.
So when any of those 7 come up, then Senator Josh Hawley says, I object to this.
Yeah, so the objection has to be in writing, but he'll notify the vice president that he has an objection. He has to get somebody from the House to agree with the objection, which with 435 members is not going to be hard to do.
Right, I'm sure. Right. I'm sure there's one Republican that'll say, yeah, okay, let's do this.
So at that point, the vice president has to stop the count and has to give the House and the Senate separate, and they each debate for up to 2 hours whether to go along with this objection or to overrule it.
Okay. So it's likely then in this case that the House, which is majority Democrat, will not go along with Josh Hawley's objection.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk in people discussing this that it's 1 vote per state delegation, but that's not the case. They're talking about a situation where you have a tie in the Electoral College. In that situation, the House does choose the president by 1 vote per state delegation, but that's not the situation when you're talking about objecting to counting the electoral counts. It's 1 vote per member. So any objection at this point is really kind of academic or symbolic. It's not going to accomplish anything given the fact that the Democrats will never support it.
Yeah, it's more so it is symbolic more than anything because you're saying that because I have seen these Facebook posts kind of circulating around social media and on Twitter where people are claiming that when a vote is triggered, then what'll happen is every senator gets one vote. And since it's majority Republican, it would go, they're thinking it would go towards the Republican side, towards Donald Trump. And then they're claiming that the House would get one vote per state, not one vote per member. And because most of the states individually actually went red, I don't know what the breakdown is number by number, but there's more red states than there are blue states, even though the blue states are more populated, which is why, how we still end up with Democratic presidents. And so in that, but you're saying that scenario that's been circulating widely on social media is not accurate in this scenario.
It's not. People are confusing the 12th Amendment with the Electoral Count Act. And the Electoral Count Act tells you how the process works for counting the Electoral College votes. And that's what we're talking about here. The 12th Amendment tells you what happens if no presidential candidate has a majority of electoral votes. And that's the
So
scenario
if they're in a dead tie.
in. Right.
Okay, so like an Electoral College dead tie.
Then the House would get one vote per state delegation, but that doesn't apply when you're talking about objections to which votes get counted in the first place.
Has there ever been an electoral tie? Do you know?
I don't believe there's ever been electoral tie. There has been objections to counting Electoral College votes, and there has been some other pretty interesting situations that apply, I think, today to what people are talking about today as well.
So now we know that this is pretty much more of a symbolic of Josh Hawley to do this. And I think personally, it's kind of a smart symbol. If you are, this is something that I know for those of us who lean more progressive, I always wish that progressives would fight harder for things. I know a lot of people even say that for Democrats in general, like with Supreme Court and, a whole grouping of issues. And they say, why don't Democrats actually grow a spine and fight? And you got to give it to Republicans. They tend to have actually a spine and fight. And this is kind of one of those moments where Josh Hawley's like, I'll show my spine, I'll get up there and I'll fight, I guess. Even though he knows ultimately it won't result in the outcome he wants, he's still kind of showing that spine.
I think you probably like it if you're a Republican who supports Donald Trump, and you probably hate it if you are a Republican senator who is in maybe a tougher state, who is being forced to choose between loyalty to Donald Trump and upholding the will of the people, depending on how you see this election. So Mitch McConnell actually has asked Republicans not to do this, but Senator Hawley is going for it anyway.
He's doing it anyway. He's wanting to put everybody's name on the line, right? So he's telling basically all of the Republicans, where do you stand on this?
Right.
And forcing them to put their name down on, do they support Trump, and do they support that? Do they believe that the election was somehow fraudulent or rigged in some way, or do they not? And they want to go in the other direction. So that it is kind of interesting that it's forcing that. And, hey, I'm all for that. Look, this is another type of force the vote. I'm a big fan of the current force the vote movement with progressives, where, trying to force a Medicare for all vote. And I would like a Medicare for all vote on the floor, so I know which Democrats are for and which Democrats are against it. I want their name in writing on that. And so, hey, you have to kind of applaud the strategy a little bit to say, well, who's for what? And that's what Josh Hawley, I guess, is going to end up forcing.
Yeah, I'm sure politicians they don't like being forced into a tough decision like that, but politicians are hired to make tough decisions. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think that personally, I haven't seen evidence of fraud that would support overturning the vote, but I think that, it's fair to expect that politicians should have to weigh in and say where they stand on it.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think that's something American people deserve.
Yeah, exactly. And they're always evading. They never want to say anything firm. They never want to take a firm stance on anything because they want to be able to backpedal it later. Right. So, okay. So you've said that this has happened before in the past. What are some of the examples how many times? I can't imagine this has happened often.
Only twice that I'm aware of. So in 1968, there was a rogue elector what they call a faithless elector in North Carolina. Richard Nixon had won North Carolina, and their state law says that the winner gets all of the electors' votes. There was one elector who, in protest, cast his vote for George Wallace. And so when North Carolina's electors came before the joint session of Congress, Nixon was reading the vote. Actually, I don't know if it was Nixon at that time. I don't remember who the vice president was. But anyway, there was an objection to counting that elector. So the Senate and the House separated into their chambers. They debated it. The Senate voted like 70. It was a big majority. They voted to count the vote, and the House voted by a significant majority to count that vote. And so that faithless elector, his vote was counted for Governor Wallace, even though he was supposed to have voted for Nixon. And then the second time was in 2000. There was, which is probably more similar to today, because there was some allegation that there was voting irregularities in Ohio. So a congresswoman from Ohio objected to counting Ohio's votes for George W. Bush. Barbara Boxer from California joined the objection. They debated, and I think Boxer was the only senator who voted in favor of her objection. I think everybody else said, no, we're counting them towards George W. Bush. And the House, it was a very significant majority, voted to squash the objection, and they gave those votes to George W. Bush. And what was interesting about that is that it was Al Gore who delivered the count to George W. Bush, even though he was a candidate on the other side. So,
because he was vice president at the time, and that's the vice president's job.
Yeah,
that sucks. But that's actually an interesting point. So all of the Democrats, so in Barbara Boxer's case, as a Democrat trying to say the Ohio election, she's challenging that, which went to George W. Bush. And no other Democrat joined her on that. They all said no.
Nobody else in the Senate did. Correct. She got someone to join in the House of Representatives, but not in the Senate. Right.
That's another one of the kind of like the Supreme Court, where we're seeing a lot of hypocrisy. We saw a lot of hypocrisy with Merrick Garland versus, I guess, all three of the justices, but most currently Amy Coney Barrett. And Republicans, of course, showed that they were hypocritical. And I guess this would maybe be potentially one of those instances where it's like, look, Democrats set the standard in that time where they disagreed with Barbara Boxer, and they said, no, we're going to support the democratic process the way that it is. And so we're going to, it'll be interesting to see with this vote how that pans out today with Republicans. Will they do the same that Democrats did in 2000?
And I suspect that the answer is going to be yes. I think that even if you had a situation where Republicans controlled the House, I think you'd have a hard time convincing a majority, even of unanimously, that all of the Republicans that have been elected to say that the election is not valid in those states. I think that's a tough sell. Certainly, I mean, Mitt Romney, Susan Collins in the Senate, I don't think that they would vote to support, overturning the election. So I think it's a tough sell regardless of what the political makeup of these houses are.
All right, so let's go over the scenario where Trump still has a path to win.
Okay, so this is
scenario.
Again, this is legally, theoretically possible. It's a super long shot, but people have also been talking about dueling slates of electors. Okay, and that happens when a state sends Trump electors and Biden electors to the joint session of Congress.
Why would they do that?
So historically, this has only happened a couple times. Originally, the first time it happened was when Rutherford B. Hayes was running for president, like in 1876. And the election was so close in several states that there was a contest about who actually won. And so that you had competing political interests from each state sending a certified slate of electors to Congress. And so then Congress gets, from these states, both Republican and Democrat electors and certificates for both of them. And they had to kind of ad lib and make up a process to deal with that. It happened again in 1960, again in a Richard Nixon election, because Hawaii, who had just become a state, was voting for the first time, and the governor certified the results for Richard Nixon, I think the night of the election, and then as a recount was ordered, and it turns out that Kennedy won Hawaii. So then Hawaii sent a second certificate, and what happened is Nixon just counted the second certificate. Everyone kind of agreed that Hawaii had gone to Kennedy, so it wasn't a controversial issue. They just disregarded the first certificate. and counted the certificate for the electors for Kennedy.
Why would they
So-
even need to send that? I mean, because obviously the election, election night being in November and then counting the electors in January, why would Hawaii even send the governor's certification? Why wouldn't the governor say, whoops, we're not even going to send it?
Well, I think he sent it actually before they found out that Nixon had lost. And so the only thing I could say is that they were new at this. It was their first election. So, but what's happening today is that in these 7 swing states where the votes have been contested, there were shadow electors that met and voted and cast their votes for Donald Trump. And so there's been a lot of speculation about, well, what happens if the legislature then certifies Trump's electors and sends a certificate to Congress with Trump electors? And in fact, Arizona has done that. And Arizona is in the middle of a lawsuit right now trying to force the court to give Vice President Pence the option of choosing Trump's electors rather than choosing Biden's electors.
What do you mean, Arizona? So you're in Arizona, your legislatures, you have a Republican. Do you have a Republican governor as well in Arizona right now?
We have a Republican governor, but he certified the election results for Joe Biden and sent the certificate of Joe Biden's electors to Congress. But there's people in the state chair of the Republican Party and some state representatives in the Republican Party have challenged that and are now ironically suing Vice President Pence to force him to count Trump's electors in Arizona.
So do they have a certificate that they've also sent off?
So it's a little unclear, but I believe that they did send a certificate. And so then the question is, what happens when Congress gets 2 certificates? And
I guess it's a big question is how is that even possible that a legislature can send a certificate and a governor can send a certificate? Why isn't it just only one can send the certificate? And are there other groups that can send certificates besides just those 2? I mean,
this is the whole problem lies in the way the Electoral Count Act was written. It just basically says, it says that you defer to state law on that issue. And so where state law is ambiguous as to how this process works, a lot of times these things happen just by tradition. And the actual black letter law maybe has some ambiguity as to the process and whether or not something other than the governor's certificate can actually count.
Right.
And so the Electoral Count Act says basically Congress can vote on it when there's no clear answer as to which one is the actual certified result. But again, in this situation, it would come down to a vote between the Senate and the House, and Trump would likely lose in that situation too. But if Vice President Pence had a good legal basis to count the Trump electors, then you might be in a situation where you actually had to have a majority in the Senate and the House that overruled Vice President Pence counting those electors. And I think that that's the situation that is really unprecedented and would be interesting to see.
Let me try to re-explain this and you tell me if I'm right on this. So the way it works is some of the states are kind of contesting because they feel that the executive branch or I guess the state election officials or maybe even the governor basically ignored state law and changed the way voting happened during the pandemic. I know that has been an accusation from some of the states. They said, no, the legislatures make the laws. You guys don't get to, and you guys overrode the laws and you made your own rules because of these, unprecedented circumstances. Understand it's unprecedented, but nonetheless, you have to follow the law. And the law is the legislatures make the election rules, right? And there's a few states that seem to be contesting this, and they had Republican legislatures and I believe Democratic governors even. So there's even more kind of political angst going on. So you're saying that if those states, if the governor and the legislatures are at odds with one another and they both send certificates, which could happen, I think, for Pennsylvania, you send Arizona potentially. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 more that would send these certificates off to Congress and to Mike Pence, who counts them. And then you're saying that Josh Hawley, who would once again rise up and say, I object to this counting, or no, I'm sorry. In this case, you're saying Pence would look at the certificates and say, okay, I got all of these options from Pennsylvania. I can choose either Trump or Biden electors. In Arizona, I can choose Trump or Biden electors. In Nevada, I can choose, right? And he says, well, then I'm just going to choose all the Trump electors.
Right. That's the situation that would be really unprecedented and really crazy. But if he can say, well, I think that the real electors are the ones that were sent by the legislature, not by the governor. The state law is unclear about which one I'm supposed to count. So then he says, okay, I'm going to count Trump. Arizona's 11 electoral votes go to Donald Trump. Of course, the Democrats are going to object. Then you separate it into the chambers.
So you're saying in this scenario, just to be clear, the Republicans like Josh Hawley would not object to this. He'd be like, great, yeah, Trump is being counted. So you're saying a Democrat senator would rise up and a Democrat House member would rise up and say, we object to this crap, because of course they would.
And then the argument that the Republicans have at that point is to say, well, you need to have a majority in both the Senate and in the House to sustain the objection. Otherwise, those Trump electors get counted. And then that's a very different calculation, right? Because then instead of needing a majority to count Trump's electors in both the House and the Senate, you actually only need a majority in either the Senate or the House. And then it becomes a realistic possibility that the Senate would vote by a very slim majority to uphold or to squash the Democrats' objections and to count those Trump electors. Now, if that were to happen, you're going to get litigation. The Democrats are going to file lawsuits in court and say that what Vice President Pence did was illegal. And then the Supreme Court would then go look at state law in those states where the elector votes were challenged, and they'll determine, was it legal under state law to count the alternative electors rather than the ones that the governor sent? And I ultimately, I think the courts would rule in favor of the Democrats. So even if this were to succeed politically, I think it would be overturned in the courts.
Maybe, but there's always a chance. And I think that's what Trump voters are looking at, is the chance. They understand. I think most that are still hoping understand that it's slim chances, but it's still a chance.
Yeah, which is, hope springs eternal for people, I suppose. I think it's an extreme long shot.
Yeah.
I think the election's likely over. I think the election, for all intents and purposes, is over, but legally, there is still this theoretical possibility that's out there.
Yeah. And it's interesting that Arizona is actually doing it. It's not just a theory, it's all of these kind of archaic laws that none of us know anything about. And it's like, what? This is even possible. What's crazier? It's one thing to learn about these laws and then say, wow, that's crazy. It's another thing that they're actually sort of happening right now, with Josh Hawley saying, I object to this count. And he's going to force a vote in Congress. And Arizona even saying, challenging the election, wanting to send two certificates, one for Trump, one for Biden. That's also, it's like unbelievable. We're living in this time when this is actually happening. The history books are coming to life, I guess.
There's not a lot of, let me just say, I've never dealt with a case like this before. There's a lot of lawyers dusting off old statutes to read what happens in these situations, because it's so bizarre and it's unusual. And the Arizona lawsuit it's really bizarre itself, and I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but it raises these very interesting questions. And
I think it really raises kind of questions on the whole process that we have for electing our federal government. I know after the last election there was a lot of talk about getting rid of the Electoral College from some people. And I think now with Josh Hawley being able to do this, and with Arizona doing this, and, kind of all of these other sort of laws we didn't even realize existed. And the fact that we could end up in a situation where Congress votes for our president and not the American people, and that it's one state, one vote. I think all of these election laws, in a way, it's really good that this is happening, because we're shining a light on all this stuff and saying, really, should we kind of be rethinking our election system and making some changes to how we go about electing our federal government?
Certainly, I think people want a situation where there's not ambiguity about who is our president. I think that it undermines a lot of people's confidence in government if there's a real dispute about who's actually leading the country.
But you know what? It happens in other countries as well. I mean, look at Israel. They're now triggering their fourth election for Netanyahu because they cannot figure that their parliament can't form a united government. And they've been unable to do this now for the last couple of years. And now they're triggering their fourth election. So I think it's kind of, I know we would love it to be very straightforward, but it's not always straightforward in other countries either.
That's true. It's important, though. I think it's important. It's worth being said that the stability of a country economically and in every other sense really comes down to a basic faith of American citizens or the citizens of that country in the rule of law of that country. And where there stops being a faith in the rule of law and that the same rules apply to everybody, that's when you start to see governments unravel, you start to see social unrest. And I don't think that that's something that would be good for anyone here. But, certainly this election has shined a light on some of the weaknesses of our system and where we probably need to maybe reform and strengthen some of those systems.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is really odd in our country, I think, is for the federal election system, for that to be so, I mean, it's not uniform state to state. It's like each state gets to make their own rules on how they go about casting votes for the federal government. And that to me seems like that should be a bit more uniform. Each state should have to follow the same rules when it comes to electing federal officials. Now, if they want to do what they want to do, on their local levels for governors or, state reps or whatever, that's one thing. But seems like it should be more, because in this situation, it is state by state. It's like you have to look at all the laws in all the states. And it's that same way for even just getting on the ballot. One of the reasons why we can't even have a third party, an effective third party in this country, is because ballot access is restricted and it depends on each and every single state for a federal office. So a lot of this stuff, I think, definitely needs to be reformed. And I think this entire situation that is happening, unfolding in front of our eyes right now, is another example of maybe one of the reasons why we should maybe look at our federal election process and maybe do some tweaking or reforming, or some people just want to throw it all out and start over. So pretty interesting. Well, thank you for explaining this. This is really, definitely interesting to learn about. So thank you so much, Ryan, for being on the show.
My pleasure. Anytime. Thanks for letting me nerd out on it. It's a really interesting topic for me. Hopefully your viewers agree. So.
I think so. Thank you so much. Ryan Tate, former candidate for Maricopa County attorney, and also currently still a lawyer practicing law with at his firm, Tate and Hall. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kim.